In a time before the world knew writing, the rivers still flowed, the winds still moved across the plains, and the sun rose and set with patient certainty. Yet every thought, every promise, every agreement existed only inside the fragile chambers of the human mind. Words lived briefly in the air and then dissolved. Memory was the only archive, and memory was never as strong as people believed. In the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, where the soil was dark and generous, and the great rivers nourished fields of barley, a small settlement stood beside the water. Mud brick houses leaned into one another. Narrow paths led toward a central temple whose tall walls cast long shadows in the afternoon light. Life seemed ordered from a distance. Crops were planted, animals were tended, offerings were made. But beneath that surface order lay a quiet instability. The people depended on memory. They remembered who had borrowed grain, who had returned oil, who had promised labor, who had paid tribute. They remembered, or believed they did. And when two memories collided, there was no way to separate truth from confidence. Among the villagers lived a man named Nabu. He was not a priest or a ruler. He worked the fields and delivered barley to the temple storehouse when harvests were good. His life was steady, shaped by the rhythm of seasons. Yet even in his ordinary routine, he felt the strain of uncertainty. Transactions were discussed, promises were made, but days blurred together. What was clear in the morning grew hazy by the next moon. The temple storehouse was the heart of the settlement's economy. Inside its thick walls were stacked sacks of grain, jars of oil, and bundles of wool. The priests oversaw these goods, ensuring they were distributed and returned. But the system relied entirely on recollection. One season, the storehouse inventory did not align with expectations. The number of barley sacks was lower than it should have been. No one claimed theft. Instead, people disagreed about what had been taken and what had been returned. Each person spoke with certainty. Each believed in the accuracy of their own memory. The arguments were not explosive. They were slow and repetitive. Voices remained calm, yet the tension lingered in the air like dust. Without proof, no disagreement could be fully resolved. Every resolution depended on trust, and trust, though powerful, was vulnerable. One morning, as the sun rose pale over the riverbanks, Nabu stood near the temple wall and watched another discussion unfold. The earth at his feet was soft from the river's overflow. He bent down and pressed his finger into the damp clay. A clear impression remained. When he lifted his hand, the mark stayed behind. He pressed again. Another mark appeared. The clay did not argue. It did not reinterpret. It simply held the shape it was given. In that quiet observation, a simple but transformative thought began to form. If a mark could remain in clay, perhaps an event could remain as well. If an agreement could leave a physical trace, it would no longer depend solely on memory. Nabu flattened a small piece of clay and pressed several lines into it. Each line represented a measure of grain. The marks were crude, nothing more than impressions, but they carried meaning. They stood in place of something absent. When the priests saw the clay piece, they recognized its potential. At first, it was a practical tool. A transaction occurred, and a mark was made. The clay tablet was left to dry in the sun. When questions arose, the tablet could be consulted. What had happened was no longer subject to interpretation alone. This change was subtle but profound. For the first time, memory moved outside the human body. It entered the physical world. Over time, the marks grew more deliberate. A reed stylus replaced the finger, creating sharper impressions. The shapes became consistent. Certain patterns represented grain, others livestock, others labor or offerings. The impressions took on a wedge-like form as the stylus was pressed at an angle. Gradually, the marks evolved into a system. Writing did not begin with poetry or philosophy. It began with accounting. It emerged from the need to count, to record, to preserve agreements accurately. It was born from inconvenience rather than inspiration. As tablets accumulated, they were stored on shelves within the temple. The settlement gained something it had never possessed before: an archive. The past was no longer limited to what someone could recall. It existed in hardened clay, waiting to be consulted. The presence of written records changed behavior. People spoke more carefully when they knew their actions would be marked. Exaggeration became risky. Disputes shortened. The clay did not replace trust, but it supported it. It provided a reference point beyond personal memory. Children began to learn the system. They practiced pressing symbols into damp clay. The repetition required patience and attention. Writing shaped not only society, but thought itself. Ideas had to be organized to be recorded. Vague impressions became structured marks. Through writing, humanity learned to extend itself beyond the limits of a single lifespan. Thought gained endurance. Words gained weight. The fleeting became fixed. From clay to stone, from papyrus to parchment, from ink to digital light, the principle remained unchanged, a human mind shaping meaning into matter. And in that act, the species transformed. It became not only one that lived and spoke, but one that remembered deliberately. Writing did not grant immortality, but it granted continuity. It allowed voices to travel across centuries. All of it began with a simple impression in damp clay, a mark that refused to fade when the hand lifted away. Before writing, time moved differently, not slower, not faster, but softer. Events dissolved at the edges. Memories overlapped like layers of dust. A promise made under the morning sun could lose its clarity by evening. A disagreement could stretch for days because there was nothing solid to anchor it. In the settlement by the river, people did not yet understand that they were living at the edge of transformation. They believed their struggles were ordinary. Barley, livestock, water rights, temple offerings. These were daily concerns. No one suspected that the quiet solution forming in damp clay would one day shape empires. The early tablets were small, rough, imperfect, but they introduced something humanity had never possessed before: externalized memory. As generations passed, the system expanded. The symbols, once tied closely to objects, grew more abstract. Efficiency demanded simplification. The marks evolved from pictorial representations into standardized signs. Eventually, they began to represent sounds as well as objects. This shift transformed writing from a tool of inventory into a tool of language. Speech itself could be captured. Names could be fixed in clay. Events could be described in sequence. Stories could endure beyond the lifetime of the storyteller. The earliest narratives appeared not as grand epics, but as simple accounts. A flood, a successful hunt, a king's offering. Gradually, imagination joined practicality. Myths took form in clay. The human desire not merely to record events, but to preserve meaning found expression in symbols. Writing altered power structures as well. Laws carved into clay became stable references. Rules no longer depended entirely on oral repetition. They could be read, examined, and enforced with greater consistency. Imperfect as they were, written laws created a new relationship between authority and memory. Years passed. Nabu grew older. The initial marks he had pressed were likely long gone, broken or returned to the earth, yet the practice remained. The temple shelves filled with tablets that chronicled births, deaths, marriages, harvests, and offerings. The rivers continued to flow. Empires would eventually rise and fall. Fires would harden some tablets and destroy others. Sand and soil would bury countless records. But beneath layers of time, clay preserved fragments of human life. Writing was never a single dramatic moment. It did not descend from the sky as a finished system. It emerged from observation, from need, from the quiet realization that memory alone was not enough. A small mark in soft earth became a bridge across generations. This shift did not merely solve arguments. It altered perception. When an event is remembered only in the mind, it remains fluid. The mind edits unconsciously. It protects pride. It fills gaps. It softens contradictions. But when an event is pressed into clay, it becomes resistant. It hardens. It refuses to adapt to emotion. This created discomfort. Some villagers felt uneasy, not because the tablets were dangerous, but because they were unforgiving. A record could not be persuaded. It could not be charmed. It could not be intimidated. For the first time, truth began to separate from personality. That separation was subtle but revolutionary. As more tablets accumulated, a quiet hierarchy formed. Those who could read the marks gained influence. Literacy was not widespread at first. It required training, precision, patience. The stylus had to be held correctly. The pressure had to be consistent. The shapes had to follow convention. Writing demanded discipline. Discipline, in turn, demanded institutions. The temple courtyard slowly transformed into a place of structured learning. Young apprentices sat in rows, each with a lump of clay and a reed stylus. They practiced symbols repeatedly. Grain, sheep, oil, labor, name, temple, king. The repetition shaped their cognition. Where once thought flowed freely and informally, writing encouraged segmentation, units, categories, definitions. The mind began to organize the world in ways that could be recorded. This was not merely technological progress, it was neurological evolution expressed culturally. As writing matured, the marks grew increasingly abstract. The earliest signs had resembled objects, but speed and efficiency favored simplification. Curves disappeared. Angles dominated. Wedge impressions replaced illustrations. Cuneiform emerged not from artistic ambition, but from ergonomic necessity. The stylus pressed at an angle left triangular marks. Repeated over generations, these wedges became standardized. Standardization is one of civilization's most powerful forces. When symbols are standardized, communication becomes scalable. When communication scales, complexity expands. Trade networks extended beyond immediate neighbors. Tablets traveled with merchants along river routes. Agreements crossed distances that oral memory alone could not reliably maintain. With writing, coordination expanded beyond the limits of face-to-face interaction. This was the true power of the invention. It allowed strangers to cooperate. Trust, once confined to familiarity, could now attach to record. But writing also introduced rigidity. Oral cultures allow flexibility. Stories evolve. Agreements adapt. Writing fixed things in place. Fixation stabilizes systems, but it also limits reinterpretation. For rulers, this was advantageous. When laws were inscribed, they gained weight. The act of carving or pressing words into a durable surface signaled permanence. A spoken law can be denied. A written one must be confronted. Power and writing began to intertwine. The authority to define reality increasingly belonged to those who controlled the record. This dynamic would echo across millennia. In the early settlement, however, the implications were still modest. The focus remained practical. Harvest tallies, labor assignments, offerings to the temple, resource management. But slowly, inevitably, writing expanded into narrative. Humans do not count indefinitely without eventually telling stories. Once symbols represented sounds, the door opened fully. Language could be transcribed, and when language is transcribed, imagination becomes preservable. The first extended narratives were simple accounts of events, flood seasons, construction projects, victories and minor conflicts. Over time, they grew more elaborate. Mythology entered clay, stories of gods shaping rivers, of kings chosen by divine will, of heroes seeking meaning. Writing allowed myth to stabilize. In oral tradition, myths shift subtly with each telling. With writing, a version becomes fixed. That fixed version gains authority. Canon emerges. Canon shapes identity. Identity shapes culture. Thus, from barley accounting to epic storytelling, writing gradually constructed civilizational memory. Meanwhile, scribes became increasingly essential. They were mediators between action and permanence. Their work required neutrality, Yet neutrality was never absolute. A slight alteration in phrasing could influence interpretation. The order of symbols could emphasize or diminish. The power to record carried ethical weight. Not all scribes bore it equally. Some recorded faithfully. Others subtly favored patrons. The potential for distortion moved from memory into inscription. Human imperfection did not vanish with writing. It simply changed medium. Centuries passed. Writing spread geographically and conceptually. In Egypt, hieroglyphs adorned stone walls. In other regions, alphabets simplified expression further. Each system reflected environmental constraints and cultural priorities. Clay, stone, papyrus, materials influenced structure. Clay encouraged compression and abstraction. Stone encouraged monumentality. Papyrus encouraged portability. Each advancement shifted the relationship between knowledge and accessibility. As writing tools became more efficient, literacy gradually broadened. It remained limited, but no longer exclusive to temple elites. Merchants kept private records. Families preserved agreements. Correspondence emerged. Private thought, once ephemeral, could be expressed without immediate audience. This fostered introspection. Writing became not only a social technology, but a psychological one. The ability to draft, revise, and reflect altered internal dialogue. Thoughts could be externalized and re-examined. Self-awareness deepened. Philosophy eventually emerged from this capacity. Abstract reasoning requires stability of language. Writing provided that stability. Scientific observation requires repeatable description. Writing enabled accumulation of knowledge across generations. Mathematics flourished when numbers could be symbolized reliably. Administration scaled when records could be archived. All of these systems trace their lineage to the moment a human hand pressed meaning into soft earth. Back in the early settlement, the transformation remained gradual. No single generation recognized its magnitude. Life continued. Crops were planted. Children were born. Elders passed away. But something unprecedented had entered the human condition. The past could now speak independently of living memory. That independence redefined mortality. When a person died, their experiences no longer vanished entirely. Their transactions, decisions, and sometimes even their thoughts remained embedded in matter. This subtle continuity reshaped how societies understood legacy. Monuments grew larger. Inscriptions became more ambitious. Names were carved deliberately to endure. Writing encouraged permanence-seeking behavior. The desire to be remembered intensified once remembrance became technically feasible. Over centuries, archives accumulated. Libraries emerged. Collections of tablets organized by topic, date, or authority. Classification systems developed. The human impulse to categorize expanded alongside recorded knowledge. This was both empowering and overwhelming. Information density increased. Specialization followed. Not everyone could master every domain. Scribes divided roles. Some specialized in law, others in trade, others in religious texts. Professionalization accelerated. The ripple effects multiplied. Education systems formalized. Curricula emerged. Standardized exercises trained students in replication before creativity. Replication ensures continuity. Creativity ensures growth. Writing balanced both. As millennia progressed, new materials replaced clay in many regions. Ink on parchment allowed greater fluidity. Alphabets reduced symbol count dramatically, increasing literacy potential. Printing technologies centuries later would amplify this exponentially. But the foundational logic remained unchanged. External memory. Durable meaning. Transferable knowledge. Even in modern times, digital storage continues the same principle. Signals replace clay. Light replaces stylus. Yet the essential act remains identical, encoding thought into persistent form. The invention of writing was not merely a technical milestone. It was a cognitive reconfiguration. It altered how humans relate to time. It transformed how authority functions. It expanded how imagination survives. It deepened introspection. It enabled accumulation. It created history as a discipline. Before writing, there were events. After writing, there was record. Record created narrative. Narrative created continuity. Continuity created civilization as we understand it. And all of this unfolded quietly, not in a single dramatic revelation, but through incremental adaptation. A line pressed into clay, a wedge shaped carefully, a symbol repeated until standardized, a tablet dried in sunlight, a shelf built to store it, a child taught to read it, a law inscribed, a story preserved. The river kept flowing. The clay kept hardening. The marks remained, and humanity stepped, almost unknowingly, into permanence. In the early centuries after the first marks were pressed into damp clay, the settlement by the river no longer felt entirely the same. The change was not visible in the shape of the houses or the rhythm of the harvest, but it lingered quietly in the spaces between people. Something invisible had taken root. The world was no longer carried solely in memory. It had begun to rest upon shelves. The temple storehouse expanded. Where once there had been only grain and oil, there were now rows of drying tablets. Some were small and narrow, holding nothing more than counts and deliveries. Others were broader, containing longer sequences of marks that described agreements, labor assignments, or temple rituals. The tablets rested in orderly stacks, their surfaces hardened by sun and time. Those who entered the storehouse began to lower their voices without quite knowing why. The room held more than goods. It held decisions. It held evidence. It held traces of lives. As writing became familiar, it began to influence how people perceived events. A harvest was no longer simply gathered, it was recorded. A marriage was not only celebrated, it was inscribed. A boundary between two fields was not merely agreed upon, it was defined in clay. Definition changed behavior. When boundaries were recorded, disputes diminished. Not because human desire disappeared, but because argument now required confrontation with a physical reference. The clay tablet did not shout, but it stood firm. It did not sway with emotion. Over time, the role of the scribe grew more structured. Young apprentices trained under experienced record keepers. Their education was rigorous and repetitive. They learned that a misplaced mark could alter meaning. A sign pressed too deeply could distort a symbol. Precision was not ornamental, it was essential. The apprentices copied model tablets endlessly. Columns of identical symbols filled their practice pieces. Through repetition, they absorbed not only the shapes of signs, but the discipline of system. Writing imposed order on thought. To inscribe something required clarity. Ambiguity had to be reduced. A vague statement could not easily be preserved. It had to be shaped into recognizable form. As the years passed, the scope of writing expanded beyond necessity. What began as a solution to accounting gradually grew into an instrument of expression. In the quiet hours after official duties were complete, some scribes experimented. They described dreams. They recounted unusual events. They composed reflections about the gods and the unpredictability of floods. These early narratives were modest, but they marked a turning point. Writing was no longer merely about what had happened. It was about what could be imagined. This shift altered the cultural landscape. Stories, once dependent on oral transmission, could now be stabilized. Variation still occurred, but a written version anchored the tale. The written form acquired authority simply by existing. Communities began to develop shared references. A story inscribed in clay could be consulted repeatedly. It did not rely on the memory of a single elder. It did not fade with age. The accumulation of tablets led naturally to organization. Shelves were grouped by topic. Tablets were sorted by subject or date. Early cataloging practices emerged. The concept of an archive began to take shape. An archive is more than a collection. It is a commitment to preservation. With preservation came historical awareness. People could look back across years and observe patterns. They could compare harvest yields. They could review past disputes. They could see continuity. This continuity fostered a new sense of identity. The settlement was no longer defined solely by its present inhabitants. It possessed a documented past. Documentation strengthened institutions. Laws inscribed in clay gained durability. Expectations became consistent across generations. When rules were recorded, they could be enforced with reference rather than recollection. The authority of writing extended beyond economics and law. Religious rituals were standardized through inscription. Sacred hymns were preserved. Myths were compiled. Divine narratives acquired structured form. The relationship between humans and the divine shifted subtly. When prayers were written, they gained permanence. When myths were fixed in symbols, their interpretation narrowed. The fluidity of oral storytelling gave way to textual stability. Writing did not eliminate variation, but it reduced unpredictability. As trade networks expanded, tablets traveled between cities. Communication between distant communities became more reliable. Contracts could be sent. Agreements could be verified. Administrative systems grew more sophisticated. With complexity came stratification. Literacy conferred advantage. Those who could read and write navigated bureaucracy more effectively. Access to information translated into influence. Yet writing also created vulnerability. Records could expose wrongdoing. A broken promise left a trace. Accountability intensified. In time, writing systems evolved further. Symbols representing objects gradually gave way to signs representing sounds. Phonetic elements entered the system, increasing flexibility. This allowed more nuanced expression of language. The abstraction of writing marked a significant cognitive leap. Instead of depicting reality directly, symbols now encoded speech itself. Language could be captured in its full range. This innovation unlocked literature. Poetic structures appeared. Rhythmic repetition was preserved. Complex narratives spanning generations were inscribed. The earliest epics took shape, telling of heroes, kings, and existential quests. These texts transcended practical necessity. They addressed mortality, purpose, and power. Writing became a vehicle for reflection. The psychological impact deepened. When thoughts could be externalized and reviewed, self-awareness expanded. Individuals began to confront their own ideas in tangible form. Revision became possible. Reflection slowed reaction. Writing extended human consciousness beyond immediate perception. Centuries continued to unfold. Empires rose and organized vast territories through written administration. Census records were compiled. Taxation systems depended on documentation. Military logistics relied on written coordination. The state itself became inseparable from writing. Without records, large-scale governance would collapse under its own complexity. Writing enabled scale. It allowed coordination across distances that oral systems could not sustain. At the same time, writing preserved dissent. Ideas critical of authority could circulate quietly. Philosophical arguments could survive suppression by existing in copied form. The medium that empowered rulers also empowered thinkers. As materials diversified, writing became more accessible. Clay gave way to papyrus in some regions, parchment in others. Ink replaced stylus. Scripts simplified. The development of alphabets dramatically reduced the number of symbols required for literacy. Fewer signs meant broader participation. This democratization unfolded slowly but persistently. Literacy expanded beyond temples and courts. Merchants kept ledgers. Families recorded lineage. Scholars compiled treatises. Knowledge accumulation accelerated. Once information could be stored reliably, innovation built upon prior innovation. Mathematics evolved. Astronomy advanced. Medicine developed through recorded observation. Each discipline depended on the continuity writing provided. Generations no longer began from zero. They inherited archives. Archives are memory multiplied. Over millennia, the physical forms changed. Scrolls replaced tablets. Books replaced scrolls. Printing presses amplified distribution. Eventually, digital systems encoded text as electrical signals. Yet beneath every transformation lay the same foundational principle first glimpsed beside a river bank: thought made durable. The human species shifted from immediate existence to cumulative existence. Cumulative existence fosters civilization. Civilization fosters complexity. Complexity requires preservation. Preservation requires writing. And so the simple act of pressing marks into damp clay extended far beyond its humble origins. It reshaped authority, religion, trade, identity, and imagination. The river settlements eventually fell to time. Their walls eroded, their temples crumbled, sand covered their streets. But beneath layers of earth, tablets endured. Centuries later, when excavators uncovered them, the marks still spoke. Silent impressions in hardened clay transmitted voices across thousands of years. The people who pressed those signs could not have imagined such reach. They sought clarity in their own moment. They sought resolution to disputes, accuracy in trade, stability in agreements. In doing so, they altered the trajectory of human history. Writing transformed memory from a fragile mental state into a shared external resource. It allowed the past to exist independently of those who experienced it. It allowed ideas to outlive their creators. It allowed continuity where once there was only succession. From that point forward, humanity was no longer confined to the lifespan of its individuals. It became anchored to recorded knowledge. The first impression in clay was not dramatic. It was quiet, unremarkable, practical. Yet from that quiet mark unfolded law, literature, philosophy, science, and the vast, intricate structures of civilization. All because a human hand once pressed meaning into earth, and the earth kept it.